Hello, I'm Stan, and you're watching the Cloud Therapist channel.
Hello and welcome to the Cloud Therapist channel. I'm Richard Simon. Is cloud computing becoming clouded? That's the question that a recent documentary seems to be asking. The documentary is called Clouded, seems to be sponsored by HPE and VMware. And it seems to be like a bit of a sort of a critique of cloud computing industry, maybe kind of more focused around the sort of the public cloud, I guess. So we'll be having a quick conversation and dissecting the topics and themes in that documentary in this panel discussion today. So I will ask Paul and Stan to introduce themselves, please, and then we'll hopefully dive into the topic. So Paul, if you can start first.
Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Bevan. I'm Research Director for IT Infrastructure at Blue Research.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Kanapka. I've been working in life sciences enterprises for the last 20 years. I'm currently working at a London-based R&D life sciences organization.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. So I think we have a fairly good balance for today. So kind of me from the tech and vendor sort of space, Paul from kind of his background and research, and Stan kind of offering us the sort of the enterprise view. So hopefully that's going to be a fairly good sort of balanced approach to our discussion today. So first thing, guys, I wanted to pick up on was the sort of the themes that you guys sort of got from the documentary. Paul, what were kind of the main themes that you sort of got from the documentary?
Well, the first was the continuing sort of inability of people to really get to grips with what is the cloud. I mean, it sort of went round and round in circles a little bit. I found quite interesting the whole sort of talk on sort of cloud economics, and the cost of cloud, etc. But probably the one for me that sort of not resonated the most, but maybe threw up the most questions, the whole issue of data sovereignty and security in the cloud, and sovereign clouds. I mean, there were plenty of others, but those were the sort of ones where you thought, there's some meat in there that we need to get to grips with, I think.
Interesting. Stan, what sort of stood out for you in terms of themes?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to see a documentary about cloud. First of all, I thought that was really cool, and for me, it was kind of like a trip down memory lane. I lived through those early days of VMware. I got certified when back when ESX came out. I'm aging myself now, but I do remember cloud evolving, and we used to joke around in the infrastructure groups and say cloud is really just someone else's data center, so there was a bit of that going on in the beginning, and then obviously that's an oversimplification, but that's hearing that evolution was really interesting. The whole cloud first strategy thing, that was discussed early in the documentary was definitely something very real, although I wouldn't say it was as wide sweeping as it came across. So it was interesting to kind of go through that that evolution and discussions about the migrations as well, which was when you're in the trenches, it was a very real thing. So I found that quite interesting.
It was really interesting to hear them talk about cloud first so early on. I think I agree with you. I mean, we're starting to see now far more organizations, particularly in public sector, saying it's got to be cloud first or cloud only even. Whereas if you go back to where they were first talking about, it was anything but. Most enterprises, ran for the hills when you talked about the cloud back in sort of the early 2000s.
Yeah, and there was, I think the other thing was that I think some of the sort of historical side of it, I didn't sort of understand that, because I mean things like Hotmail, which you could probably say was kind of really sort of email in the cloud, that started in '96, and I remember getting my first account in Hotmail in '96 because it was the in thing, of course, at the time. So I think they're sort of, the kind of the historical side of it. I'm not sure. There seemed to be kind of some mixture of things, and even Dr. Luke Julia, I think, who's from the Renault group, who was on there as one of the guests, was actually saying, we started building our own cloud, and actually that was, hang on, but that's your data center. That's not a cloud, and not what we would kind of normally define cloud being, and it's kind of, in terms of the capabilities that it provides. So that was interesting, and there was a lot of kind of hang up around sort of APIs, and that seemed to be sort of a sarcastic sort of comment around APIs. But actually, there is an API economy. So if you look at The Economist or Forbes or whatever, they all talk about sort of the API economy. So that's certainly a real thing. So that was, I think, interesting as well. Stan, anything else that you picked up on? What was kind of any other themes?
Yeah, I mean, on what you guys just said, I mean, definitely early on, I don't remember everyone jumping for joy. There was quite a lot of, and we can touch upon this later, a lot of questions about, what's it going to do to the organization? What's the workforce going to look like? Even culturally, right? I'm from the States originally, but I've spent most of my time in Europe, and there was a clear difference in the adoption. It wasn't black and white, right? Our friends in the States were a little bit more gung-ho at that time, for the cloud. In Europe, it was a little bit more conservative. I don't know if you guys have noticed that too,
yeah,
but
absolutely.
it wasn't a black and white thing, right? It wasn't, it took time. It took time to marinate, and there's still organizations now questioning, it as well. So, yeah, I mean, the other thing I noticed was, oh, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, no, I was just saying that ground. There's even a split, I think, between the UK and continental Europe in terms of our approach to the cloud and our approach to things like data sovereignty. Really interesting. We sort of come back to that. Are we or aren't we European? And sometimes we are closer to our American cousins than to the rest of Europe. So it's an odd dichotomy, isn't it? That on one hand we're talking about data sovereignty and GDPR and the problems of the Patriot Act and all those sort of things, and yet we're probably closer in mentality, I think, around cloud to the United States than we are to some of the particularly France and Germany.
Yeah, they had the guy Francesco Bonfiglio. I'm probably butchering the surname there. Who's the CEO of Gaia X. So that's definitely that kind of in that sort of sovereignty space. Okay, so that's kind of some of the things that we picked up on. What do you think, and maybe this is about Pandora's box a little bit, what do you think they actually missed out on? What was it, stuff that they didn't really mention, Paul?
Well, I mean, the big one that came across for me, and we briefly mentioned migration, but this whole issue of of digital transformation and the process of how I get from where I am today to where I need to be was it was a missed opportunity. It was almost like they jumped straight to the world's hybrid without saying, okay, but actually the ultimate destination should be this, scalable, agile, fast development type environment. All sorts of challenges of making that one work, but what's the route for enterprises today to get there? And I just, it was almost like, well, we're going to be stuck in a hybrid world forever, which may be true, but I just felt they missed a real big point there.
So you think they, before I bring you in, Stan, so they think, Paul, they kind of jumped to that, or that seemed to be kind of the direction or the solution straight away, you think, right, kind of early on in the documentary?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the whole documentary was really about, validating hybrid as the existing environment. I was going to say way forward, and we can come back to the presenter and his style at times, but actually it was, and again, it's like reading any book, always understand where the author's coming from. And I think, they'd sort of started from, hybrid's the answer, now what's the question? And but they, given that most people see a journey to the cloud, and by that I actually probably mean a public cloud, as the ultimate, destination. That's where they're trying to get to. So how do I go on that journey? And that was, I think, sadly lacking.
Sure. Stan, what did you feel they kind of didn't really highlight enough of?
Absolutely. I was thinking the same thing. I mean, at the end of the day, it was a bit, technology focused, obviously, HP, VMware, but I figured, the cultural shift that's required to make digital transformation happen. I mean, at the end, not to downplay, but cloud is a tool to deliver business outcomes. It's another tool in the tool belt, right? And it's a significant one, obviously. And there's a big part of the story about the people, right? And how you get organizations to change. Because at the end of the day, behind the scenes, there's people that, their mindset needs to shift. You got to kind of bring the organization along for the journey. And a lot of the discussion, they must have said the word workload about 100 times, and the reason workload is an interesting one. That's one dimension of the whole thing, right? But the fact is that's tied up into business processes. So when you start talking about why did migrations fail, right? Why did CEOs, 3 years later they're gone and only 10% is migrated when they said 50, right? The whole story behind that, I think, which would add color to that is, the business has to be brought along for the journey. It's not just about moving workloads, right? There's a whole broad tapestry, which I think, it does it justice if that could have been mentioned, but, there you go.
Yeah, and I mean, there's certainly a lot of, like we said, there's probably a Pandora's box. There's a lot of areas that they, didn't really sort of go into. Maybe it was kind of because of timing, but also probably because of the kind of the direction, I guess, that the documentary was really sort of taken. But certainly things like FinOps and automation, time to value, time to market, and also not forgetting startup companies or scale-up companies who are born in the cloud. They're just going to cloud. I mean, again, I think I've mentioned this before. I was at the AWS Summit in London early this year, and one of the sort of success stories that they had was the car hire company, the online car hire company, Kazoo. And Kazoo actually had, they came and presented, and they said everything that we do is serverless. There's nothing that, not even like, they're not even kind of running instances and virtual machines in the cloud. It's kind of completely serverless. The whole architecture is serverless, and they, got their website up and running in less than 90 days from nothing to actually taking customer orders and so on. So I think there's all those kind of aspects that were probably not really kind of considered or kind of they didn't go into a lot of details on them.
Well, there wasn't a lot of color in terms of the end user examples, was there? I mean, that was the bit that was missing for me. It felt like we were talking in a bit of an echo chamber amongst sort of tech professionals, rather than where's the real value in the cloud, and where are the stories, the success stories, as well as the problems. I mean, nothing's ever that smooth, but there was none of that. So it came across as slightly academically cold, from that point of view, rather than giving the color to what the hell has cloud done? Well, it's done an awful lot, guys. And here, look at the story. You do Kazoo. You could have brought up, in the UK, the Financial Times or EasyJet and people like that, who are real trailblazers for moving into sort of public cloud environments. And so you're constantly going to get the sort of bell curve of early adopters and people behind the curve and the laggards, and we didn't get any of that sort of sense. It was almost like a very flat here's where we're at, and here's where the world's going to be.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we were mentioning sort of terms, and I think I've at least I've noted down twice, maybe more, the word fluffy was used, fluffy clouds. So kind of reminded me of those sort of 90s, was it the Orbs? Little fluffy clouds or something kind of music tracks from the 90s. So that was interesting. But I think there was kind of a lot of that kind of thing going on in the documentary in general. So okay, what we're kind of some of the any sort of topics that were kind of mentioned that we're not kind of aware of, or that kind of maybe took you guys by surprise at all? Paul, if I can go to you again first.
The straight answer was no. I mean, everything that was said, and it made me question at times who their audience was, because they sort of seemed to sort of fall between two stools. If that was if they were aiming at a sort of what I call an end user business audience, then they'd have been completely confused about what was going on. And for us, people who been involved in cloud, been involved in the technology space for some time, it didn't really say anything new. So it was a sort of strange dichotomy that you found yourself in, saying, who are you actually targeting at? So yeah, they're fine. They hit on many of the right, buttons, but nothing that sort of jumped out and said, hey, that's really different. I mean, the data sovereignty versus cloud, and cloud sovereignty piece, had some moments in it where you thought, okay, this could get really interesting. But again, they were trying to cover too much too broadly, and therefore didn't get into the sort of detail.
Sure. Stan, what was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the same. I mean, I guess, being immersed in it for 20 years, I come from a certain perspective, but I did find the data sovereignty aspect interesting, and it encouraged me to do some reading. And I actually, I don't know if you guys know, but the AWS a couple of days ago came out with the data sovereignty pledge. So this is something that definitely is people are paying attention to help out organizations manage that sovereignty aspect a bit easier. But yeah, I mean, there wasn't anything I would say that would be earth shattering for myself, although it was a good walk down memory lane, as I said before, basically.
That was I think that was at the reInvent event, Stan, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. All right. So let's go on to kind of some of your favorite quotes or statements. Now, personally, I made a ton of these, I have to say. I was joking with Paul before we started. I was saying that I might have to end up doing a separate sort of monologue to myself and kind of just go through some of those statements and respond to them specifically. But let's start with you, Stan. What was kind of some of your favorite sort of quotes or statements that either the presenter or the guest seemed to kind of talk about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the ones that I don't remember which guest it was specifically, but they said the term cloud became clouded as soon as it arrived. So as this was as the cloud was evolving, I mean, people, they try to describe things by putting it in a box. And I think as it started evolving, cloud morphed into different things, and you had all this kind of stuff coming out. And it goes back to, what I mentioned before. Me and the guys back in the day used to joke around saying it's someone else's data center, so I found that interesting. The closing comment I thought was nice. From the cloud architect gentleman, he basically said, the right workload at the right time for the right reasons. That I thought was relevant. So yeah, those kind of piqued my interest.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because Scott Roberts, I think, is the gentleman who's from the co-op group, but he actually started it by saying it's shocking and I hate it because it's in his title. So I found that a little bit amusing that towards the end, actually, he had the final word on that, which was interesting. Paul, what was your kind of what your thoughts?
I mean, I like Scott Robertson's approach, a very down to earth. I think it was the guy in the front line, having to deal with these things. I thought that was quite good. So I would have used the same as you, Stan, in terms of that. But there were one or two that caught. I mean, I'll save the funny ones for later. There was a couple of funny ones that have all sorts of implications, but one of the ones that came across, and I think it was probably Corey Quinn, who's, I don't know if you know Corey, and his sort of.
I do now.
Yeah, well, actually, I follow his, I'm his newsletter, and he's quite good on the sort of whole AWS front, and gives them quite a hard time when he wants to. But first time I'd heard him speak, but I think it was him that said, "We're all procurement now, whether we know it or not."
I've got that as well. Yeah, I wrote that down.
And it was sort of it was an interesting one, partly because I think it highlighted two things for me. One is the relationship changes between the technology vendor and the enterprise in this sort of cloud environment, and I think an awful lot of enterprises have not understood that. But I also think it's wrong to think that the enterprise companies have not now started to get their act together in terms of cloud economics and cloud control. In fact, AWS and Azure's latest quarterly statements actually come out and mention the fact that there is pressure from their customers on pricing. So they're actually putting that as a forward-looking statement, saying they're going to come under price pressure from their customers, which suggests that we're sort of past the was it the Microsoft guy saying, drain your credit card pretty quickly? We're past that sort of approach, and I think companies have got to grips with that. So I think that's probably not the way to look at it. But the idea that actually we're all in procurement now was just sort of sparked off all those conversations. So I thought that was quite interesting. And the other one, which again is Corey Quinn again, he's quite quotable, isn't he? When they were talking about systemic risk. And he said, welcome to the conversation. It was like, yeah, absolutely. And that is something I think that, and it's more broadly with the sort of connected, digital world that we live in, that there is a level of systemic risk that I don't think an awful lot of people have understood. Supply chain problems in the last year have shown just how interconnected we are and just how much we rely on digital and just what happens when it goes wrong. So I think it was an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I made a ton of those, but again, Corey Quinn, who's from the Duckbill group, I believe. I mean, it kind of went everything. There was a bit of gaslighting, I think, sort of in some of his some of the statements, and it kind of went everything from conspiratorial to I think he called the bills, the public cloud bills, horrifying. But actually, if you look on the website, it actually says, and I quote this, it actually says on the website, heck, we're not even AWS partners on their website. So, which was quite interesting to kind of talking about public cloud. Actually, they're not even partners of AWS, which is so that was quite interesting. They kind of make lots of claims on the website, but yeah, it kind of went from that for me to I'm not sure, kind of. Yeah, Thomas Morrow, who's from I think one of the evangelists at Microsoft. He seemed to be kind of maybe the odd person out of that sort of group. Everybody else was kind of, from that sort of, or gunning for sort of, hybrid sort of solutions or aiming for hybrid solutions. And Thomas obviously working for Microsoft, and I see a lot of his stuff because I'm connected to him. He was kind of more about the kind of how he advises customers. So he said some things like, customers come with emotions and set ideals, or words to that effect. That's not a direct, quote, but it was something like that. And he said that he found it kind of quite difficult to, persuade them to change those ideals, or change those that kind of mindset as well. And I didn't see a lot of sort of defense from him, maybe on that aspect of it, or cloud in general. But that was interesting.
He did drop one, and I don't know whether he did it knowingly. In fact, I'm pretty certain he wouldn't have done it knowingly. But I think it was probably when they were talking about the edge, hybrid cloud and the edge towards the end. And he was talking about how, the cloud's everywhere, and we're talking to the customers about coming down to the edge. And I thought that was a really telling statement, of the way in which AWS and Microsoft Azure particularly position cloud out to the edge as really an extension of their control plane right out to the edge. And you think, well, is that real? Is it possible? And you and I have had this debate before, and I take a somewhat different view to that. But it was sort of, one of those sort of Freudian slip moments where he said, oh, suddenly the world domination view of AWS outposts, suddenly, or Microsoft stack, became reality without him realizing it. And I think there's a real different story that is a complete different documentary around, what do we do about the edge? And they sort of tacked that on at the end, which was, I found that odd. But
yeah, and I think the other one was Joe Bagley, who's, I believe, from VMware. He said the word cloud has become a meaningless word. So again, that was early on in the documentary, I think.
So, I mean, Stan, you'll know I probably I could talk for England, so, please chime in. But I mean, it gets me thinking all the time. One thing that right up front, you come right back to the front, was none of them really got to grips with what is cloud. It's a consumption model, guys. And effectively, the decisions you as a business, as an enterprise, are taking is, how far up the stack do I want to hand over ownership and control to somebody else? It's that sort of, and we can go into the sort of technicalities of private, hybrid, public, but fundamentally it's a cloud, it's a consumption model.
Let's go on to the I mean, the other subject, which I think was fairly early on, was around cost and kind of, worried about sort of your public cloud bills and stuff like that. So that's obviously a huge subject. And obviously, despite what they were kind of saying, it's a concern for both, on-prem and cloud as well. So I wasn't really personally convinced that the documentary was, made a fair comparison of that. But Stan, what was your feelings around that?
Yeah, I mean, that was interesting. I think it's useful to kind of, try to understand what happens in organizations regarding cost, at least the ones I've been a part of. And typically when you're working in an IT department and you have a project, you go through a business case, right? And the business case has capital expense and operating expense. And in the old model, right, you would have to, spend £500,000 on a rack with servers and all that infrastructure, which, the barrier to entry for specific projects, IT or business projects related to infrastructure was quite high relatively, right? So I think one of the things that happened regarding cost with the cloud is it changed the discussion a bit. Finance was, for whatever reason at that time, more open to supporting a more long-term operating cost than they were for a one-time, massive CapEx cost, relatively speaking. So it ended up, allowing a lot more projects to come through, right? It created the impression that, the long-term cost was less of an issue regarding, getting projects through the door. So, it created this interesting discussion. And what it also did is, this is kind of linked to cost, is, I think they briefly touched upon it. It enables the business to kind of make their own purchases, sometimes in the absence of IT, which had started to occur. And it led to the establishment of shadow IT, almost, in a way, right? Because anyone with a credit card can go out and subscribe to a SaaS service or whatever, whether it's a project management tool or whatever, a web-based service, for example. So, I mean, it opened up a lot of opportunities, but it also created some various other considerations. So, it was that was an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. Intrigued by the sort of discussion that went on there, because the thing that didn't come out for me was, what's the outcome we're getting for the costs we're paying? I mean, I had a great discussion at a roundtable recently with a guy he was a technical architect at a big European bank, and they sort of re-architected into the cloud all their sort of analytics, and he was getting under pressure from people saying, "Hey, how much we're spending far more money on analytics now than we ever did when we had it in-house." And he pointed out, he said, "Well, we're doing far more and you're getting far better information out of it as a result of that." And yet they could only see, this sort of Corey Quinn thing, the bill reaches $1 million and everybody goes, "Oh, now what do we do?" And actually what he was saying is that there's this broken link, if you like, between cost and the business outcome. And they're seeing the cost but not understanding the business outcome. That could be down to internal communications, and we can sort of come back to that. I think there's still a huge gap between the understanding of senior business management and the corporate board with what actually happens in the IT operations arena. So I think, development. So I think, well, that was, to your point, Stanley, I think, it is interesting. I think people have moved on an awful long way, but really there needs to be a focus on, and this is where I thought it was unfair, was that there was no focus on what's the outcomes, the better outcomes you're getting out of going to the public cloud in some of these specific areas. It would have been great to see that.
I agree. And I think, I mean, the one that really, in that sort of cost theme that they were talking about, the one that really I kind of understood at the beginning, but then I kind of lost it a little bit. Maybe that's just me, but when Scott Robertson from Co-op Group was kind of talking about data center costs versus in the cloud, and he kind of described data center costs. He says nobody pays for that. It's a hidden cost. It's a central deployment. I didn't even get what that actually really meant. And then you said, but you have property things like, power, cooling. But then you kind of, once you pay for that VM, he said it's free from day 2. I failed to see how that would be when you have to continue to consider cooling, power, support personnel, security, floor space, rental if you're renting your data center
Yeah.
space, let alone kind of depreciation and maintenance. Things like BIOSes and firmware updates is a headache enough for hardware. Believe me, and I've done that in previous lifetimes. So I didn't get how he was kind of saying, well, from day 2 the VM in the data center is free, but when cloud you pay for it every day. It's like I don't know, 5 pence or something, per hour, or whatever it is. But again, the capex which you mentioned is you're paying for that sort of server, whether it's £2,000 or whatever's worth of 1U server, whatever it is, or Blade server. You pay for that, up front. Whereas in the cloud, you're kind of, I guess, paying for that compute as you go. And obviously, if you do the architecture in your cloud more cleverly, then you don't have to even do that anymore, right? With serverless and switching things off. So I didn't see that I didn't get what he kind of went into, and I made a real note to try and quote and not misquote or misunderstand what he was saying or misrepresent what he was saying. But I just didn't get what he was saying in that. It didn't make sense to me. And then the comparison was completely off, I think, for me, from what he said.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. It just made me think of, in the old school way, in the context of virtual machines, right? You buy the box, you had the VMs running, and one of the interesting things to the point there that we kind of evolved when we started putting a little bit more rigor around charging and the rest of it. We wouldn't charge the business previously, right? It would be an IT cost, et cetera. What the cloud enabled us to do is we were able to finally adopt first a show back model and then a charge back model to the business.
Yeah.
Right. So they weren't prepared. I'm not sure they were prepared for that because they didn't see it before. Right. It was running in a data center somewhere that IT managed, and we had they had a rack with the VM that was carved out just for them, but they weren't getting a monthly statement. Right. And so maybe that's what he was referring to, that aspect of the business becoming aware of cost.
Yeah,
in the cloud
maybe.
not, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with Stan. I think that's exactly what he was getting at. From an operational point of view, they didn't see those costs. I mean, and I think some of the early days when you were trying to do the cost and benefit analysis of moving to the cloud, trying to get out of organizations how much they were spending on the underlying data center infrastructure, the cooling, the power, the heat, the light, and how you allocated that to various departments, or systems was very difficult to get. And there's another fly in the ointment too, which I suspected he might be occurring to, is that a lot of financial services organizations need as much capital on their balance sheet as they can get, and actually moving to an operating model made life quite difficult for them. I think they've got over that, but you go back to the early days of the cloud and some of the financial engineering that was going on, they were going actually, in terms of being compliant with the sort of capital adequacy rules, and use as much capital on the balance sheet as possible. And we were taking it off.
Yeah,
So,
just to correct a previous quote. So the bit where I said about Corey Quinn actually calling it the bills horrifying, it's actually their website that I believe that calls it quite horrifying. But nevertheless, it's still Duck Bill Group. So okay, so just a very quick side question on this. Isn't that kind of some of the themes that we've the documentary kind of talked about, and especially around the sort of costs and stuff like that? Isn't this more of a failure of of enterprises and organizations, and I guess to a degree sort of IT departments? Although that kind of comparison that sort of Scott Robinson kind of made, I appreciate kind of maybe now I appreciate a bit more. Thank you for explaining that a bit more for me, guys. But the overall sort of assets management and depreciation of that asset kind of from that sort of capex model is still there, obviously, for the entire company. So maybe the end users don't see it, but IT and certainly the CFO would see it. But having said all of that, the question was, is this kind of more some of these things that were not, not done properly, and with the enterprise are not done properly. Is this because the enterprise is just not kind of planning their strategy for cloud better? Kind of, Paul, what's your take very quick on that?
Oh my goodness. I think there's a large element of truth in that cloud has happened by osmosis in many companies rather than a sort of planned strategy. And therefore you're constantly sort of backpedaling, the credit card syndrome, the shadow IT syndrome. Or companies made very arbitrary decisions. I mean, again, big European bank did the sort of run the bank, develop the bank approach. And the develop the bank approach was the Wild West, really. I mean, in terms of they just let them loose and go. And the run the bank was sort of, make it as cost effective as you can possibly do it without thinking around, well, how do I move to that, develop the bank? And it became almost like a sort of real life example of Gartner's bimodal IT, which I hate, but I mean, we'll come back to that. So,
Sure.
So I think there's an element of truth in that. And again, I'm not sure that AWS and Azure and everybody else thought through. I mean, they couldn't have foreseen the explosion, the breaking up into lots of different bits in terms of a microservices approach of all the different services you could put together. And therefore it's happening so fast that they were, okay, I've got another service, I better put a price for that together. So you ended up with quite a complex, and people say, oh, it's lack of transparency. Well, it's just there's a lot of different things you can buy. And now there's a lot of overlap between the things you can buy, and if you've got to work it out. So again, it's back to, I think we mentioned the term architecting before. You need to get back to some real decent, architecting of what business outcomes we want, what's the architecture look like that we need to support that, all those sort of issues. So it is a failure on enterprises' part, but I think the hyperscalers haven't helped because they have simply thrown one cost layer on top of another one, and trying to work your way through it has become quite difficult, to the point where you've now got a whole vendor community doing a sort of cloud cost optimization solutions, haven't you? I'm trying to work that one out. So, but it was ever thus, I think, in terms of it's moving so fast. But I think somebody needs to take breath.
Sure. Stan, you're kind of in that space. What's kind of your experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, it did. I agree with Paul. I mean, it did kind of happen by osmosis and organically. And as far as IT is concerned, that was something IT was focusing on, but largely the business had no clue. They might have heard about it, they might have read something about it in the paper, but they didn't know what it meant. They thought it was an IT thing. So you have to start having conversations. This goes back to, moving the organization to transform, right? It's not just a technical thing, right? There's hooks and ties into the rest of the business, right? What does it mean from a governance perspective? When you talk about cost, you're asking finance, for example, in an organization to change completely the way that they look at how IT's cost is, right? And you're talking about multi-year budgets. There's a lot tied into it. So, one of the interesting things that in our case, just to give you an example that helped to move in this direction towards, I mentioned the chargeback before, is it helped finance to build discipline into the functions for what they were using, right? So on one hand, they were spending more. On the other hand, they were aware of what they were spending. So it worked. But, it goes back to change management. The technology came out so fast, and, for anyone working in AWS, every day you go into the dashboard and there's another thing. And, so it's moving incredibly quickly, faster than most organizations could adopt, right? So I just think it's about alignment. We're still playing catch up, I would say, to a large extent in enterprises globally right now about what's available, and there's a disparity there for sure.
Sure, excellent. Okay, so just getting back into kind of the documentary sort of content. Paul, did you think that the documentary kind of provided a balanced portrayal of cloud computing in general?
I think if you were sitting in an enterprise as a sort of IT operations department of an enterprise, you'd recognize what they were talking about. and feel relatively comfortable about, you know, the options in front of you. You might not have worried about you might have worried a little bit about how do I get to a sort of, you know, world, but generally, you know, no, there was no balance in terms of actually, you know, if you're if you're born in the cloud startup, or if you've got real new applications, what are you going to do with them, and how does the public cloud play into that? Which didn't come. So I think it was quite static from that point of view, and you felt that, again, you know, and I know, you know, because they're trying to protect their own environments, I think, you know, as much as anything else, you didn't get that sense of where's the real opportunity for new applications in a sort of public cloud, or a more cloud native type arena. I didn't hear that. So I think you know, if you're a forward looking enterprise, you'd have been disappointed in that.
Sure. Stan?
Yeah, I mean, I think they did a good job, as Paul said, to kind of give the classical view of cloud, and I found it, you know, more on the techie side, which I could definitely appreciate. But I think there's a bigger story about how, you know, cloud, you know, fits into the overall digital transformation. And, you know, I guess I'm biased because I'm from the enterprise angle, so it would have been, you know, helpful to kind of get that dimension as well. How do organizations, you know, do what they do regarding cloud? You know, a little bit more focus on small to medium sized businesses, you know, would have been nice. You know, my impression was they were talking about larger,
Yeah,
you know, the larger context of the enterprises. So, you know, maybe in the future installments we'll see. But yeah, I thought overall it was interesting, thought provoking.
Yeah. I mean, for me, just to and thank you for that for those opinions. I mean, for me, it seemed to be kind of you know, obviously from the angle of sort of HP and VMware, and I think I said earlier, it's kind of, you know, maybe they're seeing it from their sort of clients' attempts at, you know, migrating to cloud, and I think there were mentions about, you know, sort of only sort of 10%, you know, sort of those sort of attempts to migrate are successful or whatever, I think in the documentary. So maybe that's kind of, you know, their perspective of that. And again, I guess you can't sort of maybe cover everything and sort of go and quote all the sort of the statistics and so on. Certainly, I mean, hybrid is you know, a valid you know, sort of strategy to do, but I'm not quite sure, you know, what that looks like. And Paul, you and I think have discussed this a number of times. We've kind of gone from, you know, sort of public cloud to, you know, to hybrid or private cloud to sort of edge cloud, because I think you know, the hyperscalers are focusing on putting their services into, you know, into all of those locations. So whether you go into their public cloud or you run stuff in your, you know, data center or, you know, a colo or whatever you have, as well as your edge location, it's, you know, their approach would be to run their services. So you should be running and provisioning, you know, the same services, the same technology, and everything else. Whereas maybe some of the sort of the data center vendors kind of think, well, we can just sell a server here, and they can, you know, so they can slap on top of that, you know, VMware or Windows Server or something, or, you know, Red Hat Enterprise Linux or something like that, and then we can build up our stack as usual. And actually, that's not the strategy I think that the hyperscalers would have in mind, you know, because that way you're still working with at least two different technology stacks, and nobody, you know, and if you kind of really heavy on edge as well on IoT type of stuff, that's three technology stacks at least, and nobody would want to do that. You know, you end up kind of having pockets of expertise in your IT teams, and again, you're back to silos again, you know, with skill base and things like that. So I think there's again a disparity or maybe a misunderstanding in terms of how the vendors look at it and how the hyperscalers look at it in terms of doing, you know, a hybrid cloud solution, let alone bringing in something like edge as well. So yeah, anyway, so Paul, I think you kind of want to say something there or two.
Yeah, yes, or two. You know, unfortunately, I believe a lot of that is down to, the competitive environment between the hyperscalers and where their strategy and their vision takes them, and where clearly from a defensive point of view, where the existing vendors are trying to create their own niche and their own space, which is difficult then for the enterprises to sort of navigate their way through. I mean, for example, I'm desperately wary of the sort of clouds, down to the edge approach of an AWS or an Azure, just on the grounds that one of the key elements of cloud right from the start was scalability on demand. Now there's a limit at the edge of how you do that, and so yes, you can bring a control plane down there, but is an AWS Outposts, sort of mobile, server room, really scalable? And the answer, of course, is no, it's not, in the sense of an original cloud. Back to what was cloud all about. One of the key things was, you can scale it up and scale it down at will, and the vendors of hyperconverged infrastructure have sort of come up with various both financial and sort of operating schemes, if you like, to make a level of flexibility around that. I mean, you look at GreenLake from HP, it gives you a level of flexibility, but a lot of it is a financial engineering rather than genuine scalability. And you come right down to the edge, where IoT sensors are starting to work, and you can't have that sort of type of cloud there. So I am very, very aware of that. I take the point that you want to, you might say that this is an argument that says if, Canonical or OpenShift or whoever have something that works at sort of, the IoT level, and they've got something pretty similar all the way up the stack, maybe that's a really good argument for going the other way. So rather than cloud down to the edge, I'd say, actually, if you can get what works at the edge scaled up into the cloud, maybe go that way around, which I think would scare the living daylights out of AWS and Azure, certainly in terms of their margins, because obviously they make more on the software than the hardware side. So that's my take.
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole edge discussion interesting. I guess it's all about what is the business case for edge. I mean, I get the IoT thing and the rest. I wonder if pressure from just the fact that in large cities, most like Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, there's space running out in data centers, right? I wonder if there's additional pressure coming on hyperscalers from that angle, right, where they're looking to kind of distribute some of that stuff. I'm not an expert in this area, but I understand, from a power consumption perspective, from a space perspective, those are all challenges that we're seeing in big cities. So
yeah,
I guess it's what are the drivers,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the for me, it's not the IoT devices. It's actually processing what they're producing, at the edge. And this is kind of the whole idea of sort of edge cloud, if you like, or edge computing, is processing stuff at the edge and only shunting back stuff to HQ. That's kind of the metadata or the result of of that. And I think at that level, you'll certainly the strategy for the hyperscalers, which I was saying earlier, is that they want to run their platform, their services on that edge cloud, back to that hybrid environment in your data center or in the colo location, and back to the public cloud as well. That I think is a clash with what the traditional data center vendors really have in mind, and I think what they were sort of aiming towards, with their sort of definition of a hybrid cloud. So that's probably two different types of hybrid cloud. But anyway, we can probably debate that forever. So let's just have some. Maybe we can do like a part two. But let's have some final thoughts. Paul, what were kind of your final thoughts on the documentary itself? What did you think of the documentary overall?
I did find it very curious. I mean, Stan, my background is long time in sales and marketing in IT. And I kept looking at it thinking, who's their audience? What are they trying to say? And obviously being aware of the fact that it's VMware and HPE, you think, okay, there's a story going in there. So I was, from that perspective, I just felt yes, it asked some interesting, questions and that, but it sort of fell between two stools for me. Between it wasn't techy enough for those of us who've been in, wanted to get to the grips with the technical. And, if you were an end user, why on earth would you spend an hour and a quarter nearly watching it? And what would you have got out of it? And the answer is probably not a lot. But the thing I wanted to, almost the one I wanted to come in, it was sort of the funny moment was the lady who was talking, who's the regulatory tech woman. And she made a point at some time that this was about getting data sovereignty under control. And she's talking about it's a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest, which, and you thought, oh my goodness me, I had all sorts of visions of, senior Azure and AWS tech execs in very exotic outfits. But I also came back to, to OVH Cloud in Europe. And their founder and chairman, Octave Klaber, is a great, loves his rock music and has his own rock band. And if you go to an OVH Cloud Summit, you always end up with him on stage with his band playing, and they did it from the Olympia. But again, you laugh, but it's interesting that they've got a very different approach. And we're talking about, sovereign cloud. People like OVH, who coming from a French background, have a very different approach to, how they market and position themselves in terms of that. So I think, it is a real alternative. But it was that sort of one funny statement, on one side thinking, oh God, not the Eurovision Song Contest, please. And then suddenly realizing that there is an alternative in terms of OVH Cloud.
Yeah, probably
quite different.
Probably not the best analogy. That was the lady's name, I think, was Nirvana Farhadi. She's a regulatory technology expert. Stan, what's your final thoughts and overall on the documentary itself?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was an interesting overview, looking back in hindsight and kind of reflecting on some of the things around, adoption, how we got to where we are today. As Paul mentioned, it would have been interesting to go into a bit more of the future stuff, talking a bit more about the edge rather than just kind of an afterthought and wrapping it up. And a little bit more on the enterprise perspective would have been nice. But I thought it was okay, thought provoking. But again, who is it geared towards? I mean, that's an interesting one. So yeah, overall okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, just final thoughts for me is a lot of it, I think, as we said earlier, is probably quite academic. We've kind of been there. We've seen all of that. We know that's kind of the historical kind of view. Some of the things that were again pointed out were also academic. It was like, yeah, we know the cost. We need to work on that. Yeah, we need to work on sovereignty, for data and things like that. Some of it was attributed to cloud, and I wouldn't really necessarily kind of call that cloud in the enterprise side. I'd kind of call that more on the consumer side. I think even the presenter actually said, we're all these petabytes of exabytes of data and things like that. So yeah, but that's kind of social media is doing that. We're not doing that in the enterprise. And then you're kind of bringing it down to from that down to the enterprise. So it's kind of attributing some things that were not maybe necessarily the direct sort of result of what enterprises do. So there was a lot of, I think, that as well. But yeah, it was certainly kind of very focused on hybrid. Again, as I said, I'm not sure their definition of hybrid is the hyperscaler's definition of hybrid. We'll see how that works out in the future. That might be a discussion for you and I, Paul, to go through at some point. Maybe get some opinions on that, do a bit of background digging, and then maybe we can pick that up in a Cloud State of Play or something. But yeah, excellent. I really appreciate you guys coming on to do this, and really thankful for your insights and your views. Yeah, I think it's been really interesting. We'll see how this kind of space really goes in the future. Things are changing so rapidly, so we'll see how things move forward. So yeah, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this this particular talk, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this talk, please subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.